Thank you for asking me to speak about resilience and offering a moral, excuse me, a moral ethical perspective. This is the outline of my presentation, an introduction pointing out that ethics is probably the weak link, something which is missing in our climate discussions. Then calling the climate crisis a moral crisis, the many ecological apartheeds that we live with, and from historical, social, and intergenerational perspective. Then we go to see how from moral crisis, we go to the ethical challenge, how we can weave justice into climate discourse. Speaking of justice, equity, and solidarity. And fourthly, the need for an integral perspective. There I will come to the response, the second part of my presentation. And I will conclude speaking of the need to raise our prophetic voice. So this is the outline of my presentation. Let me begin with pointing out that ethics is probably not getting the place it deserves. And allow me to narrate an anecdote, since most of us are from the academic world. A professor who walks into the study of another professor, his friend, and he sees lots of books there in his study. He picks up one book and he notices that there is a seal of the university library there. He picks up another book and there is a seal of a public library. He goes and picks up another book from another shelf, and again there is a seal of a library. So obviously, the books were stolen. So he walks back to his friend and says, "My dear friend, where is your ethics?" And the professor says, "Oh, ethics, that is on the other shelf." So it's a humorous anecdote, but just to narrate. That probably we need to speak more about ethics. And I would like to quote John Hookton, author of many IPCC reports, who said, "Considerations of morality, equity, justice, attitudes, and motivation, qualities that make up the moral climate that need to be put alongside the physics, chemistry, biology, and dynamics that govern the equations describing the physical climate." So we need to bring in more the moral climate. So that is by way of introduction. Let me go to my first point, looking at the climate crisis as a moral crisis, because there are many ecological apartheeds that we are living with. The current ecological crisis and the climate crisis in particular unmask the many moral travesties of our times. And I would like to highlight three of them from the historical perspective, social, and intergenerational. I'm sure most of these things are known to us, but please allow me to highlight them. From the historical perspective, the rich and industrialized nations dominate the cumulative emissions account, and several estimates, something like 92% of all excess historical emissions. Then when it comes to per capita, 1,100 tons of CO2 for those in the UK or America, compared with 66 tons for China and 23 tons for inhabitants of India. That's why Desmond Tutu years ago very prophetically said, "The world's poor are being harmed through a problem that is not of their own making. The footprint of a Malawian farmer or the Haitian slum dweller barely registers in the Earth's atmosphere." And a very important study, if I remember well, it was presented at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in 2014. Two of our eminent colleagues, Professor Ramanathan and Professor Partha Dasgupta, who pointed out that the top 1 billion people are responsible for 50% of greenhouse gas emissions. A further 3 billion, so the so-called middle class, for 45%, and nearly the other half of humanity, just 5%. So this is the reason why we can say that the climate crisis reveals the contours of an ecological apartheid into which humanity is drifting. And you see, this slide is very clear. The two worlds in which we live. It came out in the Lancet magazine journal for those in the medical profession, for doctors, a few years ago. The two worlds in which we live. On the top, we have the map of the world in terms of emissions, which are the countries emitting most. And you see the US is so conspicuous, Europe is very conspicuous, India, China, and you don't see Africa on the top. Below, we have the map of the world in terms of mortality, people dying due to the climate crisis. And you see Africa is so conspicuous, India is so evident. So this is the apartheid, that we live with. That's the reason, very courageously, Pope Francis in Laudato Si speaks about the true ecological debt, particularly between the global north and south, connected to commercial imbalances with effects on the environment and the disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries over long periods of time, historically. And he concludes, the warming caused by huge consumption on the part of some of the rich countries has repercussions on the poorest. So we also speak about the climate debt, the ecological debt. But it's not just historical. Unfortunately, this is something which is getting larger, this inequality currently, because overconsumption by the world's richest people is the prime motive, prime reason for the climate crisis. Recent data from Oxfam shows that the wealthiest 1% of humanity is responsible for twice as many as the emissions of the poorest. And that is very, very scandalous. Just 1% contributing more than half of humanity. And we know that the top 10%, 771 million individuals, emit on average 31 tons of CO2, and they're responsible for 48% of global CO2 emissions. And the bottom 50%, they are just responsible for 12% of emissions. So this is what is happening. And it's not just between rich and developing countries, it's all over. And one of the recent studies show that it's increasing, especially in Brazil, India, Indonesia, especially the global south. Now, this is the house of Mukesh Ambani in India, the sixth richest person of Asia, a 27-floor house, just for him and his family of 5 people. Just a few kilometers from there, you will also see Asia's largest slum, Dharavi, where 1 million people live piled up. So this is, again, the ecological apartheid that's happening today. And as we know, we speak of the climate crisis as anthropogenic, caused by humanity. But as many people have pointed out, to be more correct, we say it's not the entire humanity. It's a small minority. And on the other hand, also among the victims, there are some groups that are more affected: children, women, minorities, marginalized groups, indigenous communities. And it's all clear when we look at the impacts of the crisis on basic areas of human welfare like food security, health, and migration. We know that In 48 seconds, every 48 seconds, there's someone dying of hunger in the Horn of Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, but also in the area of health and migration, in the dicastery for promoting integral human development, where I serve. We did a study 2 years ago on climate crisis and displacement. And one of the conclusions of the study was that today, climate crisis and ecological factors cause 3 to 10 times more displacement than all the other factors. So the poor are suffering. I know Gabriela is going to speak after me, the perspective of youth. And Pope Francis very prophetically anticipated it when in Laudato Si asked, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? So this is the moral crisis. Let me go to the third point. How do we respond to this moral crisis? Weaving justice into the climate discourse, and that is our response. Given the deeply moral character of the ecological crisis, a true and effective response to it will have to be distinctly ethical. A physical response, as all of us are convinced, I'm sure, will not suffice. We need to build up an ethical vision built on the 3 pillars of justice, equity, and solidarity. What Pope Francis told us in Laudato Si. Today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Civil society is very sensitive to it, and people are very sensitive to it. I remember the last few COPs, whenever we met with youth groups, they are really concerned about justice. To quote Greta Thunberg, she says, the climate crisis is, of course, only a symptom of a much larger crisis. A crisis based on the idea that some people are worth more than others, and therefore have the right to exploit and steal other people's land and resources. It is very naive to believe that we can solve this crisis without confronting the roots of it. That's why it's important to make an ethical distinction between luxury emissions and subsistence survival emissions. I think especially for scientists, it's important. Physically, all greenhouse gas emissions cause climate change. There's no difference emission coming from the US or from Sri Lanka or from anywhere in the world. But they do not have the same ethical standing. The emissions arising from living in large, inefficient houses, flying for frivolous reasons, and driving inefficient vehicles are qualitatively distinct from those associated with poor households, using wood-burning stoves for cooking their frugal meals and kerosene for lighting. In this regard, the methane emissions produced by an Indian subsistence farmer growing rice are not comparable with CO2 discharges of the German owner of a big limousine. The former are survival emissions, the latter are luxury emissions. And ethically, it's important to make this distinction. And when we speak of allotting the limited carbon atmosphere remaining, we need to make sure that it is allotted for the development, for the survival of the poor communities so that they can live with dignity. That's the reason we say the rights of the poor for survival emissions are indeed non-negotiable. So the first principle is justice. Equally important is equity. This principle of equity, which is a precondition for justice. The principle of equity is based on the foundational value of human equality and dignity, that just for the fact of being humans, we are all equal. All religions profess it, the civil society, all constitutions recognize it. Namely, that all persons are born equal and have equal rights to the resources of our home planet, our common habitat, and its common atmosphere. That's why people in the developing countries are entitled for per capita emissions rights on an equal footing with the people of the developed world. Dave Jamieson asks, every person has a right to the same level of greenhouse gas emissions as every other person. It is hard to see why being an American or Australian gives someone a right to more emissions, or why being a Brazilian or Chinese gives someone a lesser right. And we know in our world today, equity is missing. This is an image which always moves me. It's of children on the street in Manila, painted by an artist who unfortunately died of cancer, but he left all his earnings for a foundation that's taking care of the children. You know, in Christianity, we speak of the Eucharist as the Lord's Supper. And imagine millions of our people, of our brothers and sisters, are still struggling even to have a full meal a day. And so this is the reason that we are far from being equal. That takes us to solidarity. Here we are widening the picture from justice to equity. We embrace solidarity, which is more than responsibility. It is what we would call co-responsibility. After Laudato Si, Earth as our common home, Pope Francis brought out the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, that we are all sisters and brothers in our common home. So it is being co-responsible for our common home and for all the members of our common household, especially the poor and most vulnerable, because in a family, we begin taking care of the weakest. If a child falls sick, the entire family comes around that child. And why are not we doing it at the global level for the entire human family? Solidarity springs from the profound conviction, as John Paul II wrote in his social encyclical, Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, that we are all really responsible for all. Pope Francis often asks the question of Cain, the counted question that Cain put to God, am I the keeper of my brother? No, we are keepers of our sisters and brothers. In order to truly achieve equal justice, for all the members of our common household, we need to strengthen the conviction that we are one single human family. So we need to build up an ethical vision based on justice, equity, and solidarity. I go to the last part of my presentation, the need for an integral perspective. So I go to the how do we respond to this moral crisis, to this ethical challenge? I would say by developing or by promoting an integral ecological vision of interrelatedness. I'm so happy that in our conference, we have people from all over, from all disciplines. That's important because we are all interrelated. At the same time, we also need, so we need to bring in our various disciplines, but also we need to create a global alliance mirroring our interdependence. No one can survive alone. That's the reason we need scientists, we need faith leaders, we need activists, we need economists, we need youth, we need indigenous communities, we need women, we need everyone. And I don't want to be just theoretical. At the dicastery, thanks to Cardinal Turkson, our former prefect, under his leadership, we developed the Laudato Si Action Platform, which is inspired by this integral ecological vision, which is trying to create an alliance of people of goodwill. This integral ecological vision, as we find in Laudato Si, that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships with God, with our neighbor, and with earth itself. This morning, one of the questions was about how faith communities can come in. And I think we need to bring in faith communities. So that gives probably a deeper perspective. We spoke about the physical climate, we spoke of the moral climate, but there's also a spiritual dimension to it. And they say 83% of humanity belongs to one religion or another. So it is a huge constituency where they bring in a different perspective. And all this is realized in the Laudato Si Action Platform, which was announced by Pope Francis at the end of the Laudato Si year, and providentially was launched on 14th of November. That was the World Day of the Poor. So it's again a message probably saying that hope will come from below. This integral vision. So like the SDGs, we proposed 7 Laudato Si goals, that we respond to the cry of the earth. So climate, biodiversity, water, all the physical dimension part of it. That we respond to the cry of the poor, that we keep the indigenous, the migrants, women trafficked, children on the street at the center, wherever the most vulnerable communities are there. That we rethink our economics, and we had a brilliant lecture by Professor Zamani this morning, that we rethink our economical paradigm. At the micro level, we change our lifestyles, then the 2 pillars of education and spirituality, and 7thly, we do all this together. Involving everyone, this is second aspect, an integral vision, but also a common alliance. So we are proposing a 7-year journey. Scientists tell us this, children tell us this, we don't have time. So in 7 years, our families, our parishes, dioceses, our educational institutions, our hospitals, healthcare centers, our businesses, farms, organizations, religious orders. And I'm happy to say some of the major religious orders, like the Jesuits, have entered the Laudato Si Action Platform, and we have hundreds, thousands of them, hundreds of universities, and we do all this together. The Catholic Church is walking the synodal journey, walking together, and the Laudato Si Action Platform is one of the signs, one of the expressions of the synodal journey. I conclude with this invitation that it is time to raise our prophetic voice. I would say
Joshtrom, can you wrap up, please?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Time is up. Time is up.
Thank you. That we become prophets, because prophets see things ahead. That we also bring in best practices, we offer hope. Allow me to conclude with this prayer in Laudato Si. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and distraction. Amen. And once again, my apologies in this personal situation for the confusion at the beginning, but I've been with you from this morning and delighted to be with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.